Ladies, gentlemen, non-binary beings, welcome to Facts Matter. I'm your host, Aton. This is the co-host, Mookie. And today, we're going to delve into progressive liberalism. We're going to delve into how October the 7th is the equivalent of your favorite actor caught on film urinating on a car, or a cat, or something really, really cute. And then we find out that the movie is actually recent. And then the day later, we find out that our favorite actor is also a crackhead who loves prostitutes and is the president's son. So let's go ahead and break this down for you and explain why October 7th and the subsequent fallout from college campuses is the equivalent of such an analogy. First, we're going to talk about Middle Eastern IQ. It's something people from the West and developed nations seem to struggle with, in that they look at everything from the way that they would examine things in our own society, in our own civilization, in our own culture. And they forget to take into account that a lot of the people that they're trying to create these parallels with have fundamental understandings of life that are in many ways opposite to what we would consider as, let's say, important or place emphasis and value on. Now, Middle Eastern people, and especially Muslims, have a very high Middle Eastern IQ. And they just pretend like they have a really low Middle Eastern IQ when you ask them questions like, why do none of the other Arab countries want to take the Palestinians in? And, they'll normally huff and haw and say it's somehow about the Jews originally taking the land and how every Palestinian refuses to be an immigrant based on that. But the reality is that we have refugee camps inside Lebanon that have existed there for many generations now. And those people, there's documentaries about them, they still lament the fact that they cannot gain employment status inside Lebanon. They will be accepted into the universities in Beirut where they can pay for an education, but then they can't use that education to actually do anything inside Lebanon to earn a living. They cannot gain immigration status. So you tell me what that is, because I would argue that's apartheid. Now, let's rotate to another reason, or rather another glaring fact of history that many Muslims like to gloss over or neglect to bring up, and that's called Black September. In 1970, and this is actually the original Intifada. So when people are chanting for Intifada in the streets, they should realize that this is actually the first circumstance of Intifada, what I'm going to describe to you right now. And that is when Palestinian refugees inside of Jordan, after the 1967 war that Jordan lost on their behalf, as a show of their courtesy and gratitude to King Hussein, who gave them a place to live even after he was destroyed by this war he fought in their name, they tried to kill him twice. So that may explain to you why the Jordanians may be just a little hesitant about why they take on more Palestinian refugees. So now that we have these two very important facts of history outlined, I think I've made at least a credible argument as to why some Muslim nations might be a little apprehensive about taking them on as refugees more than they already have. Now we can talk about what Palestine really is in terms of its cultural autonomy. We have to understand that prior to 1947 and the fallout between the British Mandate trying to establish a two-state solution, Palestine was only 30 years prior to that a part of the Ottoman Empire. Now, the Ottoman Empire was established in 1229, and it encompasses all of Palestine, parts of Africa. It encompasses like all of Syria, It was a huge, huge empire that formed over hundreds of years, and Palestinians were just one regional component of this vast empire. it's fair to assume that people migrated to and from other parts of that empire, stopping through there, establishing their own communities and whatnot. Maybe some of their communities blending in with the rest of the empire. It functioned in the same way that every regional area of an empire functions, in that it played a purpose. Now, what purpose did it probably play? Probably as an agricultural center. It's well known that most Palestinians during the 1920, 1930, 1940s, let's say, were a nomadic people who would have had goat herds, maybe they were raising horses. That was probably the predominant occupation. Now, what does a goat herder really do for a living? Well, he takes his goats from one region or another and he grazes them at pasture. The thing about Israel is at that point in time, it was not irrigated, the land was not well cultivated. Therefore, it would have been very difficult for a Palestinian herder to sit in one spot for a prolonged period of time without needing to move to find pastures to graze his sheep on. What does that inevitably mean? Well, it means that he probably either lives on a tent that he moves around in with his herd, or more likely he has an established settlement, a house, somewhere in another part of Palestine where he is not grazing his herd. So what does that really mean? Well, it kind of means that there is a small Palestinian community that is effectively using lands bestowed by the empire, or let's say emperor, king, so that they have lands to graze their sheep on. Does this technically belong to them? Did it technically ever belong to them? I would argue that it didn't. I would argue that when you look at the deeds and noble titles, which all governments, which all kingdoms, which all countries are predicated on, regardless of what government system has hold of them, all lands are divided up in this way. Even the Native Americans, the lands that they claim or that they can prove that they have, they're documents of paper with a signature on them of some important guy that said, I made this deal with them. So I don't understand how people can claim Israel is illegitimate when every nation and every people is predicated on the understanding that some powerful guy basically said that place exists and these are its borders, which is in no way different to what happened in Israel. I could argue that Israel is one of the most democratic nations ever birthed, since it was literally formed through a democratic process, as opposed to many other kingdoms which were formed based on noble lineages, secret handshakes between those noble lineages, and the wars that they fought. So now that we've kind of covered these very important glaring aspects of Palestinian society that are often glossed over, we come to the understanding that the Ottoman Empire dissolves after World War I. Its noble deeds and titles become property of the League of Nations, what is today the current United Nations. So when we have post-secondary university graduates from what's supposed to be the most esteemed Ivy League institution in the world, how do we have these fallacies in basic understandings of legitimacy where it comes to a nation's identity, its people, its culture? That's something I'm struggling with, because if we take the model for Palestine, what you're basically advocating for is every sub-regional group of Muslim within greater countries. Let's say Iraq is a good example, Lebanon is a good example, where you have, let's say, a Shia and a Sunni population. Their cultures, their customs are different. So what are you advocating for now? That Lebanon is no longer a legitimate country either? That now there should be a spot for the Shia and the Sunni and the Christians, and it should be three separate countries? Or should the Shia just eliminate the Sunni and the Christians and they're the real indigenous people? How does it work? You tell me, because I'm just using your logic to try and understand how this would apply to Israel, right? Because if you're using that logic with Israel, you have to use it with everyone else, or else you're clearly not using a fair model. I think anybody with a brain can understand. So, moving past all of this, right? When you understand that these basic premises are the foundations on which the calls for genocide are happening through, And then you start adding in things like, where did all the donor money come from to these universities? Oh, it came from Qatar. And suddenly all these universities have these departments for Middle Eastern studies that are not teaching what I just said or what I just talked about, that are not even bringing this stuff up. They're just feeding selective points and bits of information out of history, going really in depth into those pieces, providing context which does not have the other parts of history that would completely refute whatever context they are actually trying to peddle. And I think that if you actually dissect whatever it is they're teaching, you're going to find a lot of this stuff that I'm telling you right now that other people talk about missing. I'm sure they don't talk about how the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem was meeting with Hitler in 1941, or the Jewish pogroms of 1929 by Palestinians, long before the Jewish exodus, long before Palestinians could ever claim, oh, well, there were so many Jews in 1947 and they were a threat to us, and that's why we couldn't accept a two-state solution. So how does this all now tie into, let's say, BLM? Well, BLM was actually the first group that was on the streets of Manhattan protesting in support of the Palestinians on October 7th. That is right after it was announced that 1,400 civilians were killed. There were already people on the streets, part of the BLM movement, who were calling for a ceasefire and were already calling for restraint from Israel. So if that alone doesn't reveal to you what someone's agenda really is, or what BLM stands for, or at least what some of its core stands for, then I don't really know what does. To claim like you should just run into the streets and start screaming in support of one group or another without ascertaining the facts, I think that's a real dangerous mindset to have. And that's sadly what we saw at the beginning of this war too, where, you know, the BBC is announcing Israel bombs a hospital and it doesn't. It seems like in this one conflict, all the rules are out the window. And thank God that we're seeing the hypocrisy being revealed by these institutions in terms of like how they've allowed anti-Semitism to fester. So one thing people need to understand is when all the leads tie together, open borders, this new agenda of education in the schools, I'm sure it all ties back to BLM and George Soros. And now ask yourself, why would a rich Jew who's a first generation rich Jew, what reason would he have to want to, let's say, kill a bunch of humanity off so that resources aren't consumed, so that his now first generational wealth, which is in the top 0.1%, can build a dynasty moving forward? Does that make any less sense than, oh, he's a real humanitarian and wants the best for us? Like, really now, just use your common logic. How do rich, evil people normally behave? That's all. It's really as simple as that, especially when all the facts add up. All right, guys, that's enough for today. That's enough of my conspiracy theories and rambling. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll get back to you with more soon.